we are getting some economies of scale for our first ever meeting. And not only did I do the announcements, but I'm actually the speaker for this month's topic as well. So once again, just to reintroduce myself, Chris Beatty, you can see the long, lengthy title that I have there, Connected Technologies Account Executive. There's a bit of a joke within certain people in ASHRAE that nobody really knows what I do. And frankly, most days I feel like I don't know what I do either. So if you don't know what a Connected Technologies Account Executive is, don't worry about that. But specifically, I'm giving a presentation today about Smart Buildings 101 because it ties into the overall presidential theme for this year for ASHRAE. So everyone that's up to date on their ASHRAE dues received this ASHRAE journal here a couple of months ago, announcing the presidential theme and the new officers for ASHRAE to society level. So Chuck Golich, who's the ASHRAE president for this year, his theme is all around the ASHRAE digital landscape. And you particularly see the title there, the Digital Lighthouse and Industry 4.0. And specifically just how we as an organization and as a society and even as an industry are in this unique shift right now into the digital age. And President Golich here is really focusing on what's ASHRAE's role in that and in the construction industry as that digital age is starting to come about. So it definitely coincides just with all the focus on the digital collaboration and meetings and everything that we're trying to adapt to in light of COVID. But also there's just been this ongoing transition that's been occurring the last few almost generations, but particularly the last few years and few decades, as we've seen just how the digital world is starting to shape the way that we build buildings. So you can see his overall theme is, or one of the quotes I took from his overall theme that has to do with improving our harvest. So think of harvest in terms of what we can do with a building, begins with altering our view of work. So that kind of encompasses the overall idea of what we're trying to talk about here today. Is a lot of people have used this term smart buildings, but really the definition of what a smart building is very much up into interpretation. So you can see here, I just Googled in dictionary.com, what is a smart building, and I have 20 different definitions came out. And so if we don't even know what the word smart is in most situations, trying to now apply that to buildings becomes even more difficult. A few disclaimers just to talk about what this presentation is intended to. First off, we're not focusing on anything specific about a product. I happen to work for a product manufacturer, but this presentation really has nothing to do with any specific piece of equipment or anything of that nature. I'm not telling you about the advantages of any special black boxes or anything of that nature. A lot of this content is kind of from a variety of sources, a number of which is stuff that I've used in my job. It's stuff that I've learned in classes, stuff that I've seen from other people's presentations, and also content that I've seen from ASHRAE. And so really this is Chris Beatty's take on what is the state of the industry on this quote unquote smart buildings. Really, where are we? And where do we need to go, and what are some of the things that get in the way of that? So it's a little more of an encompassing discussion just for us to define some of the terminology as we go forward this year and really dive into this theme of smart buildings in the digital landscape in correlation to what President Golich is focusing on for this year. Once again, not only is it not a topic specifically about a product, but we're not even talking about a specific technology. So there's a lot of things that can make a building quote unquote smart, but there isn't one particular thing, one particular product or technology that makes it smart. However, the conversation is about how do multiple things come into play holistically, interact with one another, integrate with one another, ultimately to work in the modern building that we're working on today. So we're kind of seeing the forest, in light of the trees, if you will. And also, we want to have a conversation about how these trends and technologies, and specifically how technologies interact, will impact buildings moving forward. Lastly, it's about process and how do the processes that we typically use don't always apply in creating these smart buildings, and what are some of those disconnects that create that. And my last disclaimer is I'm not a very quote smart person, so there's probably going to be a few that will be a little bit disappointed in this presentation, just because you might be expecting a very technical type discussion, You might be thinking that we're going to look underneath the hood of the car, so to speak, on some of these algorithms or a Hartman loop or whatever it is on how do we make our buildings smart, and or what are some recommendations for IDF designs or RCDD type of discussions. Really, none of that is my focus today, and really none of that is what my expertise is in at all. I'm not a first adopter. I'm not a person. I have a small record collection. I write every day in an analog journal with a pen and a paper. And I was one of the last people that I know of to get a smartphone. So this really what I'm hoping to drive home is more of a historical outlook on how our industry got to where we're at today. And also what's kind of getting in the way of us taking the next step. Magazine was Industry 4.0. And so, frankly, the first time I heard of that term was when I heard this presidential message for this year. As Industry 4.0, that's a new one for me. We seem to use different words to describe smart buildings, and we come up with new ones every couple of months. And so I looked at up what the definition of this was, and here is probably the best graphic that I saw just to really think of what they're trying to describe. The term Industry 4.0 was coined at a World Economic Forum a number of years ago, when a bunch of business leaders got together just to talk about where the state of the world is in light of technology. A lot of people have heard of in the Industrial Revolution, and you can see just the way that they're defining that is 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and obviously we're in the fourth. And the progression has gone from the Industrial Revolution, where for the first time we've unlocked the power of steam. We're able to use some sort of mechanical production. Interchangeable parts, and how that really changed the way that we did manufacturing processes. To about 1870, we then were into what we call the technological revolution. Obviously, some of you might argue a little bit about what the dates were or some of these definitions, but this is kind of what broadly the most generic terms seem to try to define these as. But that's when we really went into more of the use of electrical energy and how that changed the way that we do things. Think of now we're starting to talk more so into Model T Fords and what Henry Ford did for manufacturing processes in the technological revolution. And then we got into this digital revolution, and that really started about the late 70s. So now we're starting to see how IT comes into the world, and how we start introducing microprocessors, and how just for the first time the internet and all the different computing power starts to have its place into the way that we do industry and build things. And now we're frankly onto something else altogether. I didn't find a neat little term that encompasses what this is, from to rival industrial, technological, or digital. Maybe that's why they're just now numbering them, because we've kind of gone past the adjectives and gone past what these words describe. But now we're talking more about how do we use big data and all the real Internet of Things type of connectivity to make our processes something else altogether. And with that comes a lot of opportunity, but with that comes, and even as we progress through this, there's less and less, agreement on what each of these different innovations really brings to the table. And that's kind of where we find ourselves right now, and it's certainly changing rapidly. If we had this presentation in person, I was going to play buzzword bingo with you, because I'll probably use each one of these at some point just accidentally. But the reality is we have so many different words in the smart building space that mean just about the same thing. There's little nuances to each one, but we kind of use them interchangeably. So you can see some of those digital, big data, fully integrated, this Industry 4.0 that I just described to you. I've talked to the facility directors before that just say, man, it'd be just nice if things talk to each other. When I talk about smart buildings, really I'm using that as a term that encompasses all of these types of thoughts, because for me, the definition of what each of those terms means is less important, and it's more so on what ultimately is the goal we're trying to achieve with technology. And we'll talk a little bit about that here at Coming Up. Just to make matters even more confusing, I've been on our quote unquote smart buildings team at my current employer for about 7 years. Within that time, I've been on, we call that team Network Integration Solutions, Major Projects, Building-Wide Systems Integration, Technology Contracting, Technology Professional Services, Connected Technologies, and Advanced Digital Solutions. So even within a group that's trying to define themselves specifically around building technology and smart buildings, we still can't even really agree on what it is that we're trying to do and what we want to call ourselves. And I'll tell you a dirty little secret, all those things are the exact same thing. ultimately, at the end of the day, our process did not change drastically with each one of those rebranding. It was just us trying to adapt to the industry and call ourselves something that's a little bit more specific to what it is we actually do. But at the same time, each one of those has its own trade-offs. And you know, can anybody really tell me that they can see the word connected technologies and know with 100% certainty what exactly that means? There's just not a good enough agreement on what that vocabulary is in smart buildings, that a lot of times we talk about one thing and somebody else might be thinking of something altogether. So why is it that this is so hard to describe? Well, at the end of the day, the problem is that our buildings there's no part of a building and really no part of the way we live our lives that hasn't been impacted in some way by this digital revolution and into the, you know, this industry 4.0 type of technology space that we live in now. So all of the facets of our lives have been impacted in some way, but not uniformly throughout. And our buildings are no different. So within the buildings, we've typically organized all these systems within, you know, somewhat at a department level, but also at a budget level. So we created these silos. So we have these building systems that are managed by the facilities departments, you know, like your building automation system, maybe your fire alarm system, maybe your, you know, your HVAC is not necessarily, you know, be able to have a design guide for a smart building by the end of this presentation. But really the first step is prioritizing, and particularly prioritizing our systems and our technologies, because just because you can integrate something or integrate two systems together, or just because you can make something quote unquote smart, that doesn't mean you should. So probably the best tool that I'm aware of to help us do this is there's this concept called design thinking that has an application in buildings that, you know, it's been applied to a lot, particularly in the product development space. There's a design thinking was really as a term and a process coined by some consulting firms that worked with Steve Jobs and Apple early on the product development phase to try to figure out what is it about a product that really makes people fall in love with it. How do we make products that meet specific needs, and now people can use them in their daily lives in a way that really helps them, you know, accomplish very simple tasks. And so this method called design thinking, they started codifying that, and a particular consulting group started codifying this, and when they worked with Steve Jobs and Apple, and started applying it from the product development world. But it has a very broad application as well to the building space that I think we're slowly starting to see. So really the idea of a design thinking is, how do we start with empathizing? How do we start with understanding what are the things that go wrong in somebody's interaction in a building? So think of a hospital as an example. What are the things that makes nurses' lives hell? What are the things that just drive them crazy? And how do we start developing solutions to address those real felt concerns and real felt needs? Well, more times than not, our first idea of what those, you know, if we go from empathizing, feeling the pain, to defining, you know, now we start defining what the causes are and what the, you know, desired outcomes are. We're probably not going to nail it the very first time on what the right solution is. So we have to create a lot of ideas. We have to prototype those ideas. We have to test them. And then we have to try to get a whole bunch of feedback to see what worked and what didn't work before we now go and implement it. Now, this is a long process. And here's the fine print. Engineers aren't intuitively good at leading these conversations. We're very solutions-minded people. We like to, you know, really go and jump to this define, ideate, you know, prototype phase very, very quickly. And if we even get that far, and if we just hear there's a problem, now I got the answer, we jump to those conclusions very quickly. And it drives my wife crazy anytime, you know, I have an argument with her, or she's trying to tell me how her day went. I completely skip this empathize phase. I completely skip the define phase of trying to really figure out what it is that my wife's trying to communicate with me and why she's upset today, and I just try to fix it, right? And I think a lot of engineers are like that. So we have to start developing roles on our team for people that are good at this process to figure out what are the applications for technology and how can technology solve these actual problems, rather than us just trying to guess and jump to the solution right away. So step 2 now is going into more shifting the way that we now build out those solutions. So integration is a team sport, and technology and building a smart building is a team sport. And really, there has to be some sort of design assist type of involvement from multiple stakeholders. So some of the output from that first step, this design thinking, most of it, if it's done well, is centered around this idea of human-centered design. So this is a slide from a presentation that a colleague of mine put together on a project where they were trying to map out the experience of going to an ambulatory care center. So an ambulatory care center, you have it's outpatient type of procedures or checkups. You know, people aren't hospitalized. We're not looking at the experience from what it's like to live in a patient room for 3 or 4 days. It's really more so, what is it like to come from your house to check into a hospital, then get treatment, and then have to repeat that process over and over and over. So how do we facilitate that process itself in a way that, you know, ultimately gives you the best possible outcome? Well, this is just one slide from a whole day in the life type of presentation that got built out for us to really try to understand that in total patient experience. So if you have any friends that do any sort of web development, you might have heard this term UX design. It stands for user experience. My brother's he's a UX designer that works for a company here in town. And if you just call him a website developer, it's like the most condescending thing you can say to a UX designer, because his job isn't just to build a website. It's really to understand the way that somebody experiences the website and how their interactions can be enhanced, and ultimately to serve the purpose of what it is that that website or that digital platform is trying to achieve. We need to apply that same idea to buildings. So that's what this is. So in this particular example, we got a guy named Tim. Tim arrived, and his picture showed up on a tablet that was provided by an ambassador who's a hospital employee that's in charge of the check-in procedures. The ambassador greeted Tim by name and accessed his patient information from a tablet. He finishes he finished Tim's check-in, and including the forms and the copay right when he walked in, and then let him know that he will receive a text message or a page letting him know that he was ready when the doctor's ready to go. So that's what the experience looked like. Notice we didn't really talk about how we're doing any of that yet. We're just trying to figure out what this experience is. And you can probably even think of a whole bunch of ways that things you would like or wouldn't like about this if you were Tim. But that's part of the process. You define what that total experience or that outcome is supposed to look like. And then you get a lot of feedback from a lot of different people saying, you know what, that part would work, that part wouldn't work. And I would, instead of getting talking to an ambassador on a tablet, I'd rather, get an email. I'd rather get, just ask Siri for all that information, whatever it is. We need to, once you hone in on what this experience looks like, then you can start going on to the design assist component, where now you're trying to figure out how do you do it. So most of the time we jump, we don't even always jump to here. We jump right into this sort of thinking of how do we do it. So after you define what the use case is, so the use case is one specific technology interaction. So if we go back to Tim's tablet example, the use case of that would be some sort of mobile check-in from a tablet. Okay, we've defined that is important to us. We want to make sure that works. Now we start figuring out how do we do that. And so the term use case, it's not something that I coined or anybody that I know coined. I think that it's actually taken more so from the IT world, that they've thought a lot more in terms of use cases in the past than at least I have in the building space. But it's very, very helpful at just now breaking down technologies, not in terms of individual products or individual platforms, but individual applications of that technology. So a good way of thinking about this, if you're familiar with sequences of operations for building automation systems, is how do you make a sequence of operations for your technology systems? What's one specific application? What's one specific use case thing they're trying to pull out? Now, how does that technology map itself out from system to system, and how do you follow the information in order to chart out that integration? So kind of what this diagram is showing is you can see these yellow dots are showing really the sequence of things that have to happen. So if you can read that. Step one, patient's RFID card activates wireless card reader in the first floor exam room. This isn't for our Tim examples, for something else. Number two, RFID card reader and reader location information is processed by an IT system. That system that sends patient's environmental control preference to the room's AMX system. Then clinician initiates the patient custom preferences, yada, 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 right? So you can see we're charting out how does the information get transferred from a patient badge to different servers, then that enables a specific outcome that happens at this AMX panel, which is it was a audio visual control panel in this particular application. So That's step 2, design assist. Build out those use cases, and after you figure out what it is that you're trying to achieve from your smart building. Now, step 3, now this comes down to your procurement. How do you pick the partners that play well in the sandbox? Remember our example before where we talked about just, this is what a typical design bid build project looks like? I would offer you that the reality is that this model was developed before technology outcomes were ever a consideration. We were back in, think of your industry 2.0 days, your industry 3.0 days, certainly not in this 4.0 world that we find ourselves. And so we created a system that made a lot of sense at the time based off where technology is, but the way that we build those systems or the way that we achieve those goals is drastically different now. So we got to rethink the way that we procure certain systems in order to enable technology outcomes. And frankly, this needs to be a whole lot more customized than we typically think about it for projects that have high technology needs. Not every single building needs to have its own specific procurement model just for technology. It's just not a need. I remember having a meeting once with a gentleman that works for a developer in town, and he told me, all I want is a time clock. When it comes, I don't even need a full building automation system. I just wish everybody would just give me a time clock. Turn it on, turn it off. That's all I want. And for some applications, that's fine. And that's all you need. So there's no sense in having to change the way that we do everything into a format that not everybody's comfortable with. When at the end of the day, the owner says, all I need is a time clock. That's what solves the most amount of my problems with the least amount of pain and effort. But if we're trying to do something like we talked about with Tim, and how do we enable a check-in process that really streamlines the whole experience of coming into an ambulatory care center, this traditional model is going to make it really difficult. So toolkit, something other than design, bid, build. We need to rethink the way that we package these systems together based off of enabling those technology outcomes that we defined earlier. And once again, it's hard for me not to stress this enough. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of approach. We don't need to put all of these blue systems underneath a single point of contact or a single contractor if at the end of the day, we're not trying to solve problems where that necessitates it. So just a couple of thoughts around that. Remember, the goal is to arrive at the best outcome for the problem the owner is trying to solve. So once again, keep that as your guiding star, your North Star, is what is that technology outcome that we're trying to solve? And then everything else falls into place after that. But using that design thinking idea as a philosophy, we're trying to get collaboration from cross-functional departments to really get as much feedback as we can on what will work and what won't work. So this is cross-functional input, not just from the owner and the design team, but different users that work within the owner's organization. A great example is, once again, going back to healthcare, the nurses are probably going to be using the most of this technology, more so than anybody else. And who has the best feedback on what actually works and what doesn't work? A nurse. My mom used to be a nurse. She's retired now, but man, you get her going on what made her day difficult on walking the floor and how many times she had to go between this room and that room because something wasn't working right. And I tell you what, it won't take long for you to figure out what's working, what's not working. And that similar people have those experiences across all different facilities. So you got to get that kind of feedback. But also now when you start defining how you're going to do that, those steps 2 and steps 3 on building it out, now you're going to have to get collaboration from your design partners and your contracting partners. Some people are threatened by this. Some people really hate the idea of bringing on contractors earlier in the process and giving them, a little more skin in the game. But, frankly, for the right project, it's just going to save you so many frustrations and so many headaches on the back end. And there's ways of doing that and ways of structuring those contracts in ways that, ultimately alleviate some of the concerns of somebody trying to take advantage of a given situation. Once again, I already talked about a lot of this. Rethink how systems should be packaged in subcontracts based off those use cases, and think in terms of trying to alleviate some of those concerns I was talking about before. Think about guaranteed maximum pricing or GMP type models for your technology scope. How do you use the same kind of design build philosophies that we use on construction budgets when we're hiring general contractors? And how do we tie that to specific outcomes just for the technology packages? If you have somebody that's willing to go at risk for defining a bunch of use cases and you have a good contract that lays out that you're trying to enable a specific price point to give you certain outcomes, it shifts from somebody trying to take advantage of you via change order to somebody now who's incentivized to come up with solutions. And once again, for the right project, that can mean a huge difference in trying to enabling some of those technology outcomes. So going back to our buddy Chuck once again, This was a quote that I really liked, and he was trying to hit on this philosophy once again of how do we need to shift the way we think about building buildings in order to accommodate just this change that we're now in from this industry, 3.0 or 4.0 world. So this was a quote that I really liked. He said, "By shifting from design, bid, build, flow, we can unleash the power of collaboration." He specifically was honing on one particular delivery method that works pretty well for the right project, but the same philosophy can be applied across all sorts of projects. But he said lean integrated project delivery, or lean IPD, was created for this purpose. This integrated process changes the timing and order of our engagement. Note specifically, who will build what now precedes how it will build. So once again, who will build what? So I would put a step even before that. We talk about, why are we going to build it? Then we talk about who's going to build it. And now we're talking about how are we going to build it. So I would add actually a step before that quote there in Chuck, that Chuck gives, but the philosophy still holds true. We need to rethink the way that we partner and at the end of the day, use those technology outcomes as our guiding star. Step 4, build a building that works on day one. And this is kind of just my wrap up, somewhat pithy answer, but the goal is to not have a building that when you open it up, nothing works and you're going through 6 months of trying to troubleshoot and figure this stuff out. So by doing a lot of this stuff on the front end, and it really enables that stuff to happen. And now, call your building a smart building, call your building whatever you want. Some people get really proud of trying to use certain adjectives to describe how smart or how digital or how technologically savvy their building is. But if the building just works the way it's supposed to, we have a smart building whether we call it that or not. Or at a minimum, we're using technology to get the most possible usage out of it that we needed to, because now it matches how do we solve specific problems that particular people had using the technology systems we had at our disposal. And just to wrap up, my last toolkit to all of this is you don't need to go crazy. Not everything in the world needs to be digital. And go back to my example of my buddy who is a developer that said all he wants is a time clock. One of my favorite books, and it's probably the book I'd recommend if you wanted to just start thinking in the right in these terms, is called The Revenge of Analog. And this goes through how it's a series of essays that's written by kind of a sociological minded writer that I think he works for Vanity Fair or something, one of those big periodicals. But he wrote this book about how as we become a more digitally saturated culture, we're now seeing more and more people buying records, taking pictures on film, playing board games, and analog types of products have really had a resurgence and a renaissance and are more viable than they have been for a long time. And it's a lot of the same technologies that we thought the digital world would kill. Now there's something sort of, novel and romantic about utilizing them, because there's that sort of analog approach really speaks to certain needs that we have as individuals in a way that digital technology just doesn't. So I think that in the Nebraska, we're not as prone to going overboard with technology as some other parts of the country are. But I think it's important just to always keep technology in its place and not get too overwhelmed by this 1984 type of big brother concerns about when technology takes over the world, but also not go overboard and be we've all met those people that discovered Facebook later on in life, and now they think it's the greatest thing ever, and they just at the end of the day you just kind of laugh at them because they're so infatuated with this new technology and they're really using it in ways that don't make sense, that a lot of the world doesn't use it, right? So by keeping just the limitations of technology in mind, I think it really helps at the end of the day us achieve a lot of these goals. So we got some time here. Any questions that if somebody wants to put into the chat function, if somebody wants to read those out, I'm happy to answer anything on this topic that we have time for. And once again, I'm not too smart, so it might be some things that I can't answer. But I'm looking at the chat function now. Okay, I'm not seeing anything.
Chris, you got one question that came in saying, do you see Wi-Fi networks maxing out?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe. So the thing that's interesting is that you talk to a computer scientist, and there's this rule about how there's a certain doubling period that that microprocessor, we put more and more information on the same amount of space, right? And basically the illustration is, think about like your USB drive, how that has more information in this USB drive than now than we had in the early supercomputers by huge amounts, right? So I think that, is there a point in time where we ultimately start to reaching our limit on what we can do with things like Wi-Fi? Maybe. But I think what we've proved more times than not is that as those challenges crop up, we find new and novel ways of solving those issues. And I'll tell you what, just cloud computing has completely changed the way that we view so many of what these technologies can and can't do. And that application doesn't necessarily I think apply to all the Wi-Fi top line applications you're talking about, but I do think that there's probably some limitations that will start cropping up against here in the next few decades or so. But I would think that there's so many technologies that are going to be happening here in the next couple of years that we don't even know what sort of questions to ask about what are the limitations going to be, because the rules are just going to change here in a couple of years. So once again, that's a answer from a guy that's not a smart guy on his take of it, just based off of what I think I've seen the last few years just in doing this job. Yeah, with all the extra stuff they put on, will Wi-Fi networks max out? Maybe. Certainly a concern. And I think that there's if you talk to an IT director, one of their concerns they always talk about, they hate this whole BYOD, bring your own device type of concept, because as you put more stuff on the networks, now they got to manage it, and that creates a whole bunch of risk with cybersecurity. So I think that they're probably the bigger concern right now that I've heard from the Wi-Fi and putting a whole bunch of stuff on it is less so around capacity, more so around cybersecurity and how do you make sure that those vulnerabilities are addressed. So there's actually some really cool stuff coming out of collaboration with the University of Nebraska Medical Center and HDR and the Nebraska Applied Research Institute, a few organizations here locally that are looking for creating cybersecurity standards for operational technology, or OT, and how do you limit some of those vulnerabilities. So I know they gave a presentation at the ASHRAE PDC virtual summit this year on some of the standards that ASHRAE is promoting. So some cool stuff that we're really, I think, lucky to have some of those resources here in Nebraska on looking at that. But I would say cybersecurity is probably more of an issue than Wi-Fi capacity. Any other questions? All right, well, if you think of any, my email's on the screen. Once again, I'm switching hats now. I'm really excited just for this year to kick off and us using technology in a way to solve other new problems that cropped up with COVID. So it's going to be a fun year. A couple of things just to be looking for. We're going to try to do a lot of different things, I think, on these to make these presentations really unique. And there's a lot of ideas that even came out of our board meeting earlier today. For next month, we're going to try to introduce the bottle raffle back and do that virtually. So there'll be more information coming out on that. But in the meantime, you'll be hearing from all of us shortly. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.